Literature is one of my passions, and so I was so excited to catch up with Daniel Mwesigwa to talk about his article, focusing on why startups and other stories about Africa absolutely need to be written and shared. If we can just dive right into it, Daniel, what was the inspiration for this article?
Well, the inspiration has been something that I've been pondering about for about 2 years now. And it started with the Africa is Rising narrative, which frighteningly I found to be a puff of hot air. I feel there is a severe lack of stories and a motivation and inspiration for the kids in the dorms at universities, at secondary schools, and the kids way back in primary schools who look at the big startup founders from the US, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Evan Spiegel's, but yet the realities of Africans or the realities of our markets are different from those from the West. So that was one of my major inspirations. And I looked at how the people who've been in the game, in the startup game, can actually influence, can tell more stories, can inspire and create something that is closer to a reality of Africa.
So you start off the article by saying every startup founder has a war story, and I go, I have my gladiator paint and everything. Why the concept of a war story?
The concept of a war story is actually very interesting. Almost everyone has a war story. And so I have this soldier friend of mine who's serving in the military in Uganda. And whenever I meet him, he usually has these big stories where he was like the main actor and he was like so good. And whenever I talk to him, I live somehow inspired. But when I think about it, I'm like, okay. But well, he told me the story about Eric Prince. Eric Prince is a guy who's mostly known for the infamous attack at in Iraq where civilians were killed. And he was running a security agency called Blackwater. So he told me, you know what? Eric Prince was right here in this library where we are standing. I was at his home and he has a small library. I was like, really? Then he told me the story of how he organized the meeting with Eric Prince and how people had failed. And he's like one of those middle level rank officers. And there was this feeling of grandeur, this aura of invincibility he had. And he actually pitched to me to go and read the book, Blackwater, which was in his library. So it showed me something about the importance of having these stories, and if they were told out on the bigger fora, on the bigger medium like the internet, like books, whatever megaphone is out there, I think the world would be inspired, and African startup entrepreneurs would be inspired. Instead of the stories remaining in close-knit circles, the stories remaining in peer-to-peer talks, like one-to-one or over the coffee. I feel like if we can put them out a little bit more, can bring more people to the realities, we can inspire people and we can help more people join the movement of startups.
I think you're right, Daniel. And there's actually been more recently a move towards consciously paying more attention to literature that does come out of Africa, that does celebrate African stories for children, for adults, all the way through. But why? I'm curious about your emphasis on the written word. I mean, we know that, for instance, publishing is very expensive. Buying books is very expensive. So how is this a trend that we obviously, it's a very important trend, but how do we make this trend something that's more accessible? How does reading become more accessible, especially in contexts like African countries where reading is associated with school or a luxury? How do we bridge the gap?
I think the gap could be easily be mended with the rise of the internet, with the rise of digital publishing, and with the rise of new media and new technology. So it's true, books are very expensive. It's true, there's been this whole cliched tale of African literature, it being from the post-colonial days, the days of Chinua Achebe and Walter Soyinka. We have been struggling to break from that narrative of African literature being about understanding society, understanding our historical journey. And right now there is a narrative about Africans who've been living abroad, the likes of Teju Cole, Ben Okri, and Chimamanda Adichie. So we're trying to find a middle ground. How we can put this into context. How, for example, we can write something about the startup space in Africa. You would barely find any literature about it. or perhaps if you found any, it would be by some guy from Oxford University Press or Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So we need to have a more of an insider perspective. And just to answer your question, I believe right now we have the tools. We have mobile applications, we have interactive media, we have the internet at large, we have social media, and I believe if we could harness the power of these and put them through and we focus them towards a common goal, I believe we could have more accessible, relatively cheaper ways of accessing this content, and of course, the impact would be insurmountable, in my opinion.
Phenomenal. I mean, it is a very inspiring concept, and like I said, it's a very beautiful concept. When we spoke earlier, can you talk about some initiatives maybe that you know of in Africa that are already sort of on getting on this bandwagon in the way that we would like them to? So, for instance, any sort of companies or publishing initiatives, creative or writing initiatives within the African continent that are telling stories, that are addressing the startup question, because sometimes it comes down to support. We're all, people who seek information, and so if you can just share with us what's going on, and we can obviously rally our support and put, our support behind those initiatives.
Great. So in the article I talked about Uganda startup called Mixer Kids. So Mixer Kids actually wants kids to tell their own stories. So they get these kids, the kids tell their stories. Then Mixer Kids has they're called mixerkids.com. So they have their editors who actually illustrate these stories and convert them into ebooks, which these ebooks are put out for sale, or they can be given out free of charge. Then there is another startup in Nigeria called Jenny Games. Jenny Games makes a line of interactive apps where kids are taught how to tell stories digitally, and I find these are very amazing. Because people who need these stories the most are the kids. And the bit about this is the stories do not really have to be true. We can venture into fiction. We all know what the power of storytelling can bring about. From the likes of H.G. Wells to the likes of Isaac Asimov. They laid the foundational stories of concepts that were sci-fi back in the day, but nowadays robots and humanoids are being real. So I believe if we can invent our own realities, if we can get our own stories, as long as they're going to help kids explore their minds, they're going to help the kids dream, and ostensibly they're also going to help the adults to get closer to home and to imagine the impossibilities. Then there's another startup called Fundi Bots. Fundi Bots is from Uganda, and they're actually teaching kids how to make robots. So this, however simple the beginning process could be, I believe later on, as the kids grow up, they would, it helps them dream. It helps them think of the impossibilities being possible. And to me, I find that a very positive step. So definitely there are many other companies I may not know about, and I'm sure if this is a common goal they are going to advance, the future is going to be bright.
Like I said, I'm very inspired by the notion, Daniel, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Like I said, for the listeners, we'll definitely we'll share the link in the show notes to Daniel's article so you can read it for yourself and find out more about those initiatives that he just discussed. Daniel, by the way, I love your sense of humor. I think you're hilarious. You can all keep up with Daniel on Twitter by following him at Valanche. That's VALANCHEE. Thank you so much, Daniel, for making time to chat with us.
Thank you. Pleasure is all mine.